You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and it's taxes time, Herds. Not only is it the middle of the calendar year, which means it's time for you to file your tax returns here in Australia, it's time for us to file our murder mystery tax returns by covering Agatha Christie.
Maybe this should just be the Christie time of year. You know, June is the Christie month.
I don't want to box
I don't
myself
either,
in
especially
like that,
because we're more likely to find other Christie books, which means that we'll end up doing multiple Christie books, which is just suffering, really. I shouldn't say that.
We are covering Agatha Christie's A Caribbean Mystery. This is the 10th Miss Marple story, full-length novel at that. We are covering chapters 1 to 9 today, by the way. Herds is in the hot seat. And I did really enjoy getting back to Miss Marple and just how much she loves to dunk on the way things should be done properly.
She's skeptical of everyone around her and critical of everything that they do, which is what makes her a great snoop, obviously. But I will say what I do enjoy about getting to see the inside of Miss Marple's mind is that the last time we covered her on show with the body in the library, we kind of jumped around perspectives to lots of different characters. And I feel like this novel has a slightly more Marple-centric perspective. We do have other characters' perspectives, like in particular, the Dr. Graham. We get to kind of peek inside his mind. And there are some off-to-the-side scenes with the servant, Victoria, and the owners, Molly and Tim Kendall. Like there's a couple of aside scenes, but by and large, we're watching Miss Marple run around stirring up trouble.
I think one of the things that's really great is this opening scene where we get Miss Marple not listening to a conversation.
Yes, when that's her main strong suit. It literally, in like chapter 3, she said, it's like, Miss Marple decided that she had to do something and she'd use the only weapon she had, conversation, when she's already failed at conversation.
Yeah, it's really good because so much of what happens in that opening stretch too is her just making observations and declarative statements about what's going on. I thought perhaps the most telling moment about where this mystery is going is that we spend all of this time talking about how Miss Marple isn't listening to a man, and then a woman pops up, and we don't even narrate her not listening to the
She doesn't matter. She's not important.
It was just like, oh, yes, we're home. We're back to Christie.
Yeah, well, to be fair, Major Palgrave is the murder victim in this story, so it's arguably more important that we're not listening to him.
Yes, no,
the irony
mechanically it makes
the irony of the scene. I'm defending Christie, which I know is a controversial take here on the show, but obviously, the irony of not paying attention to Major Palgrave's stories when he's the one who's going to get killed, presumably over his stories, is a foundational pillar of the story itself, of the comedy here. So, in a sense, we can forgive that, but you're right. There's a lot of strangeness with women coming and going and not really being paid the time of day.
As much as I find parts of Christie a little bit boring because it has informed so much of what we read elsewhere that coming back to it is a bit like par for the course. Just some of the out of left field things that Agatha Christie says, they're just the best.
I will say I have missed Marple's brand of investigation. I think my favorite part is when she kicks one of the ladies, I think it's Lucky maybe, while she's sitting in a chair and says, "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. Have I kicked you?" But she's like deliberately kicking people up the butt to get their attention, to drag them into conversation.
Well, yeah, she's a little trickster demon.
Is.
She goes around just causing mischief wherever she goes.
There's a lot of good characterization for her in this book, which I'm actually really enjoying. Because I remember when we did Body in the Library, we commented on how she was kind of a lie detector. She did a lot of umming and ahhing and leaning towards the suspect whenever they were in the room with them.
Yeah, her physical movements are very important to the way she is characterized.
Yes, but in this book, I mean, there is a little bit of that, but I feel like so far it's been very much focused on her directing conversations and making what I would call like social political plays, like how she decides to lie to Dr. Graham about this photo that she wants to, because Major Palgrave was about to show her a photo of a murderer, apparently, before he puts it away. He doesn't show her. And Miss Marple says to the doctor once he's died, like, can I have that photo? It's of my grandson or whatever.
It has been 22 years or something between the two Christie novels that we've read on the show. So there is bound to be some evolution in style.
It's kind of fun watching her deputized characters as well, because she's not in her hometown. She's in this resort with a recurring character who you haven't told me if this is his first or second appearance, which is concerning to say the least. But anyway, she's trying to pick allies, and she's sort of settled on Dr. Graham. And so even though she manipulates him, she then comes back around and says, well, actually, you also seem like you're on your own little investigation. She clearly feels that he is unlikely to be the killer, or is going to be useful if she comes clean and says, hey, I think this is a murder. We should sort of team up, which is fun. I like it when detectives are kind of forced to work with someone they've never worked with before. You get a completely different dynamic than you normally would, right?
I think the other thing that's like credible about why she beats around the bush to get to trusting him is because he's like retiring or something. So he could have motive that like maybe something to do with the end of his career, and her suspicion sort of sets up the weight of that potential angle to the story.
I mean, we're in Golden Age detective fiction, which means that the doctor is the most valuable piece on the board, right? Like the doctor is the character who says how the character died, whether or not the death is suspicious, if they're even dead in the first place. So figuring out whether or not we can trust the doctor is a pretty important aspect of the mystery, right?
Yeah. And especially when we have a mystery that is so apparent in some ways, I think one of the things that's really exciting about this story is the opening scene is the scene that tips the whole event off. Major Palgrave is like going through his collection of things that he brings with him to tell his anecdotes wherever he goes, because he's that sort of man. And he grows to pull out a photograph of a murderer that he has, because he found out about some man who was like tied to two similar deaths of two women, and has this calling card that he found a link with this photo, basically. And as he goes to pull out the photo, he very clearly sees something over Miss Marple's shoulder that alarms him. He runs off, and the next time he's seen is
Well,
dead.
actually, the next time we see him is he's drinking at the party when the dance is going on, which is very suspicious.
Oh, sorry, yes, there is one scene between that. But I did really like the fact that the instigating moment of the crime seems to happen right before our very eyes.
I mean, the instigating moment of the crime happens at the same time we're being introduced to the murder victim. I really enjoy that we do just get stuck into it. Can I make a confession, actually? A confession for the show?
Yes.
I am so excited to read such a short book, because the chapters are like not that long. I'm getting stuck into it. I'm enjoying the chapter, and then it's over, which means that I can then read the next chapter.
As much as we might bemoan S.S. Van Dyne, he was onto one thing, and that's that mystery novels don't need to stick around for too long all the time.
Yeah, I am really enjoying that every single chapter, like the titles to exactly what's going on in the chapter, and they're very purposeful. We get an introduction to a character, or a series of clues, or both, or some Marple characterization, or all three. And then we kind of move on, and I appreciate that.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about before we move on to the mystery section, Herds, is that I thought our selection of characters who have their own scene, not from Miss Marple's sort of perspective, was really curious to me. What was your read on that?
So they're mostly like staff, which is interesting. They're the characters that kind of live here. From my memory, we get a lot of Dr. Graham, such that I would say he falls under the Knox rule that we must not see the thoughts of the killer. I think he falls under that. But the other characters are obviously Victoria, who is the servant with her boyfriend. And the other characters are the Kendalls, Molly and Tim Kendall. It is interesting that all of the characters we've had asides with are like staff. They're all characters who give us a window into the daily workings long term of the place. We get to hear more about the drama, because the place was being run by like I think a different couple before the Kendalls came along like 6 months ago, like not that long ago, and they've taken over. And so we get a lot of like, oh, we better make sure the business stays afloat or else we're going to be in trouble.
It's always really fascinating seeing what other characters get kind of time on screen aside from the detective in mystery novels. All of these little hooks into the kind of day-to-day operation are like so unusual, I feel, for the sort of stuff that we've been covering recently, but I feel are a real like golden age staple.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of functional, right? There's this idea, or this trope, I should say, where the servants are the only ones who notice the little things that go wrong. Like the clue that we get from Victoria is that she has been in Palgrave's room and she doesn't remember seeing the serenite pills. They're the supposed like high blood pressure pills. We do often use servant characters because the servants are the ones who actually see the reality of what goes on at these high society gatherings.
I suppose, Herds, we should, as we delve deeper into the machinations of this mystery, jump over to the mystery section and interrogate you. You're listening to Death of the Reader, Flexed Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are discussing chapters 1 to 9 of Agatha Christie's A Caribbean Mystery, and we'll be back with more in just a second. Stick around.
You're listening to Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour. This is your host, Herds, and we have been absolutely smashed with tropical island murder mysteries here on the show. So we thought we'd take a break from our holiday trip to talk about a different kind of heat. I am joined in studio today by celebrated Australian journalist Michael Brissenden to discuss his latest crime fiction story, Smoke. Because where there's smoke, ... Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Hope you enjoyed that one. Yeah. So, Michael, your new novel, it deals with a broad range of hard-hitting political topics, but I hear it was inspired by the devastating bushfires of 2020. Now, I'd like to know what inspired you to set the novel in California instead of something more local and familiar.
Sure. So my family has a little house on the south coast of New South Wales, which is a spot where when this Currowan fire in New South Wales first started, that was the spot where it first hit. That was a traumatic experience, not just for me, but certainly for everybody who was there at the time. And then, as we know, that fire then spooled out all the way down to Cobargo and various other places. But the initial premise of the idea came after the fire, and I thought, well, that's a good cover for a murder. What if you found a body, you initially thought that the body was a victim of the fire, but it was discovered later that actually someone had used the fire as cover and locked this person in the shed and they couldn't get out. And so that's where the novel started. But the reason why I decided to set it somewhere different was because people I was talking to in the research phase of this particularly were incredibly traumatised by that experience. So I didn't want to set it anywhere recognisable for a start. So I started writing it at about a fictional place in New South Wales. And then it started raining in New South Wales, and it rained for about 18 months. But it was burning in California. And I have covered fires as a correspondent in California, so it wasn't completely alien territory to me. And I was talking to my agent, who is in California, and basically decided what would be a great challenge here to actually shift the entire narrative and put it in California. So that's what I did. Actually, it was a good thing to do because not only did it take it out of familiar territory for me, which made it quite challenging, but all of those issues that are in the book, there are, lots of themes in the book. There's poverty, there's healthcare issues, there's corruption, there's development corruption, there's police corruption. All of those things we have in Australia for sure. But if you put it in a place like America, suddenly those issues are magnified even more and the stakes become much higher. So that was an interesting thing too.
We had a chat with Slari Gentil discussing her novel, The Mystery Writer, which is also, she's an Australian writer setting her book in America. She said that the intrigue and conspiracy theories that are at the core of her novel could only be set in America. Do you feel like these sorts of issues it's just inherently amplified in America? Is that
they're amplified? I mean, it's not solely an American issue, And really, the book is really about how an individual, a family, and a community deal with all of those issues in a place that has suffered from a devastating wildfire and is dealing with a continuing crisis in terms of the climate. And, this is not an Australian issue either. This is happening everywhere in the world, particularly places that have temperate forests like we have. If you look at Greece, if you look at California, communities are having to deal with this changing climate and the risk of fire and all that comes with it more and more and more. So, yes, some of the underlying social issues are more magnified in a place like California. There's no doubt about that. But the broader issue about how these places deal with a changing climate and forest management and all that sort of stuff are not issues solely Australian or Californian or anywhere really. I mean, it's a global issue.
Our protagonist and detective, Alex Markov, She seems like she's constantly being backed into a corner as she's investigating all of the crime in the sea little town of Big Jasper. She finds every aspect of her own identity used as a weapon against herself. Her gender, her Russian heritage, her past work, a police force. What part of her identity was most important to you as you were kind of writing her journey?
So I really wanted to have a female protagonist of about her age. So she's 43 years old. And this really came from a lot of conversations I've had with female police officers over time, working in what is essentially a pretty misogynistic environment still, and how they have to behave to actually succeed in that environment, how they have to stand up for themselves, but they can't stand up too hard. They can't be seen as being shrill. They've got to put up with a whole lot of stuff that men in a similar situation don't have to put up with. And then they get to the point where they sort of reach a point in their career where there's just really nowhere much further to go. And I wanted to invest her with all of that sort of backstory, but I also had her Russian heritage in mind because the character of her father actually came to me first. He is a Russian Jewish Gulag survivor who got to California and has become a sort of disenchanted alcoholic dog shooting waste of a man.
He's really fun. I think that the fact that he only shows up very occasionally in the novel, there's again that smoke, that like mystery around what
he sort of comes, it drifts in and out, doesn't
what does he even want to do with his life? Like what's going on? It's not clear.
Yeah. And so that was a character actually that came to me first, but I wanted to have the female protagonist. So the two worked really well together. And I think investing her with that complicated backstory, the challenges that she's faced in her childhood, her early adulthood, and then her career in the police. And she ends up back in her hometown because joined the LAPD to get out of that town, to go to the big city, to find a family because her family was so dysfunctional. She gets there, she gets involved with a whole lot of bad cops who lead her down a rabbit burrow that she goes down for years and years and years until she gets to the point where she can't deal with it anymore. She blows the whistle on them, but they are so deeply embedded in the system that they manage to turn the internal affairs investigation back on her, and she gets exiled back to her small town.
Not to give too much away, of course.
Not to give too much away. But that all happens fairly early in the
Well, that's the thing. It is a point, and this is interesting to me that you, despite avoiding the scientist's explanations, there is a lot of context that you try to kind of delve into. You unpack it with great care as you go, right? There are a number of characters in the story who share Alex's marginalization as well. Most notably for me was the Mackenzies. I think is it Rainey and Seb?
Yeah, Rain and Seb Mackenzie.
Rain, yeah.
So Rain Mackenzie is Alex Markov's offsider. The two of them work together, and they're both outsiders. Rain Mackenzie is a local Native American who doesn't ever want to leave. It's his country. Alex fled to the city and then was forced to come back, never really wanted to come back. And she joined the police force because she wanted the police force to save her, to give her something. And he joined the police force because he wanted to change the police force and make it more relevant to his own people. So the two of them are outsiders in this adventure, if you like. And I think two characters bounce off each other, particularly in the early stages of the book, where their backstory comes through the dialogue between the two of them.
We'll also take the opportunity to kind of explore Rain's complicated history with industry. He's a character that in circumstances is torn between doing right by his own people, by the Native Americans, the First Nations people, and also looking after his own life. And this is something that a few of the characters have to kind of tangle with. How do you go about kind of writing that complicated perspective when it isn't your own lived experience?
Well, a lot of it comes from talking to them, basically. The parallels between the Indigenous experience in Australia and the Native American Indigenous experience in California is particularly stark. Like a lot of them ended up being pushed off their land when the timber industry came. They ended up essentially working in small sawmill towns, cutting the forests that were once part of their land. Then the timber industry basically was restructured, so it was a lot of the smaller lumber companies in particular were amalgamated into one big company. They closed a lot of the small sawmills. There was also a lot of national parks that were put in that locked up the forest. So their traditional connections with the forest, particularly the cultural burning and all of that sort of stuff that was really important for actual forest management, was interrupted. And there's one point here where I go into the fact that his elders used to go around with Zippo lighters and light up the forests at culturally appropriate times, and then that sort of stopped, and no one really engaged with them about the forest management practice, which is part of the problem and part of why they ended up where they are. So obviously had to talk to people there. I had covered a fire around this area called Paradise, which is up in the Sierras. And just through reading, I knew there was a Native American tribe called the Concow tribe of the Maidu Nation up there. But I tried to get in touch with them. I tried to get in touch with a whole lot of Native American overarching bodies, and no one was really taking any notice or replying to me at all, So I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I was over there doing a research trip. I put their tribal address in Google Maps, drove up there, long way up this winding track. And of course, the place wasn't there. It was burnt down. So I saw this guy walking along the street and said, "Do you know where I can get in touch with the Concow tribe?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, try down at the campground down by the lake." So I went down to the campground. They said, "Oh, actually, they own this land. Here's a number. Call this woman." I called the woman who was the head of the tribe, and she said, "Oh, that's amazing. You're the first person who's ever actually called us and asked us about this." And she put me in touch with this guy who was their cultural officer, who was a youngish guy in his 40s. And he gave me all that detail, and we had a long conversation about their part in the whole history of the forest area, the forest management and their land and, what it meant to them. And, so it was important to get all that detail right because that is an important part of the story.
That's as good a reason as any. Thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you for having me. Thanks for your interest.
Amazing. This has been a chat with Michael Brissenden about smoke. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SCR 107.3.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. Thank you so much to Affirm Press for helping us get in touch with Michael Brissenden and for providing a copy of the book for Herds to read. It's time to jump back into our feature book, which this time around is Agatha Christie's The Caribbean Mystery. It's tax time. We're talking chapters 1 to 9. And Herds.
Yes?
I'm told that you wanted to discuss the Kendalls as we entered this mystery section. I can't imagine why. They're the house help. What possible interest could they have in this case?
I have a couple of things that I want to chat about. Normally I'd be like, here's my totally fake theory for this week, but I think that the killer is so obvious based on basic deduction that we have to go for the jugular and expand as we go. As we kind of broached the topic of previously, there are a lot of characters in the cast that are part of the staff, and we've been kind of getting asides with them almost as though we're trying to develop them to be the more important characters later on in the story. So here's the thing that first drew my suspicion. During the dinner, there is a dance. Now, we don't know any dance characters. There's nobody in the dance. This dance has not been foreshadowed. It just occurs, and it happens while Major Palgrave is having his meal. I would be willing to bet that that is when the poisoning takes place. Poison, because we have this serenite drug that I've never heard of and is only on the internet as either this AI post about what serenite is that's totally fake, or a couple more entries down, the Caribbean Mystery Wikipedia entry. So it's not a real drug. It's probably something that's made up.
Or it's a drug that was taken off shelves before the internet.
You know what? That's entirely possible. You know what? I don't care.
It is entirely possible that Agatha Christie is just the most famous user of this of this sleeping pill.
She's patented it.
I'm not gonna tell you you're wrong here, but I'm telling you your reasoning is outrageous.
It doesn't matter. Look, truthfully, it doesn't matter whether it's a real drug or not. The thing is, if not like a regular tropical poison, it's probably the thing that's killed the Major. And I believe it was distributed either during the dance or as part of the food or the alcohol, let's say, because the alcohol is something we keep drawing attention to.
I think the thing I'm cautious of here, Herds, is that Agatha Christie is actually quite famous for not using untraceable poisons. It's something she has quite the reputation for enjoying poisons in her stories and following their particular quirks to their logical conclusion.
Why does it need to be untraceable? Why can't we just have an incompetent doctor who is about to retire and doesn't know what he's doing?
I don't think that's... no. Herds, what? How could you?
Because he just kind of nods along with what everybody else is saying, and even when he has suspicions, he doesn't say, it is my medical due practice to investigate the suspicion. He says, maybe I will investigate it if somebody else brings it up first. Look, there may be a fancy poison that's going on, but he died off screen in his room, as far as we know, in the middle of the night. I would be willing to bet that the device that we're leaning on here is just a bad doctor, because we know he's old and he's retiring.
He is the most powerful piece on the board, as you say.
And he's not being a very good piece. He's the queen, and the queen is off in the corner, not maximizing their movement potential.
not using his action economy effectively.
He's not. Look, the queen needs to be in the middle of the board so they can go wherever they want, as far as they want. Yeah. God, I hate the queen. point is, if I'm going with this logic, the poison is in the food or the alcohol because of the dance, then it has to be someone on staff. And I thought it might have been Molly for a little bit because she's the one who mentions the high blood pressure. But what I think is more likely after reading the scene where Tim Kendall says repeatedly, it couldn't possibly be murder. It could never be poison. Serenite is a totally normal drug that everybody takes. I think it's probably him. I would assume that he is the character in the photograph because that's the most straightforward conclusion. However, I am also going to say, and I think he's killed Palgrave's to hush it up because he did burn the photograph. He didn't burn the polo pony photo or the tiger photo. However, I'm going to say, and I don't even know if you're grading me on this, but I'm going to say that the reason why Palgrave puts the photo away is because either Jackson or is it George? I've forgotten his name. It's one of them whose like wives are being killed. I would say Jackson just because Raphael was like, oh, he's a total poser and he's running around with all the women. And I think that Palgrave's was like, I'm going to put this photo away so that I don't embarrass them with this story that is like half true or whatever. I think Kendall is the man in the picture and that he has killed Major Palgraves before he can recognize him, basically.
I see. So both the husband of the women who died and the killer are there.
Yes. Look, I'm willing to reassess this problem, but that is the current theory. I'm sure you could wrap it together by just saying that Tim Kendall is the husband and the killer. But for me, it would kind of tie in these other characters more cleanly.
I think it does make sense that there are more characters involved here in the case too, because A, that's something that Christie likes playing with, and B, I think the other clue that we get is that the like calling card it seems that the killer had is nature themed in some ways. They're talking about like the flowers.
Yeah, they keep talking about how these men are interested in flowers and butterflies, which I'll be honest, is that the poison? Is that what the poison's from? Is it a butterfly poison? Is there a butterfly that does poison, Flex? Is there a Oh, no.
Far beyond my reach of expertise.
Butterfly poison.
But yeah, because we have like Edward, for example, who's a nature enthusiast who's been going around. You know, there are like flowers all around the hotel. Obviously, like to some extent, that is just the vibe that Christie is trying to give of this hotel. But
you're right. That's probably where the poison comes from. They keep saying flowers and butterflies.
Well, I mean, Tim, Greg, and Edward all have like nature thematics to them. It's just trying to nail down A, if it's relevant, and B, like which relevance to actually lean on.
I'm going to have to look at Tim a little bit more closely because I'm still 90% certain that he's the killer because we hear about the rumor of the high blood pressure from his wife, and I reckon she's just a goss and he's told her about this high blood pressure business because I don't believe that that's real for a second. I will have to double check what thematics Tim is associated with, but I'd be willing to bet that the poison is related to his nature association, whether that be flowers, because that's in the photo. Sure, why not? Flower poison sounds good. I would also enjoy butterfly poison because that would just be really fun. For now, I'll just say it's some kind of flower poison.
Well, Herds, any other big outlying hooks you want to point out in the story before we break and return next week?
Oh, God. Is there something else that I should be aware of? That's concerning. I don't know. I don't know that there's any big mysteries that I'm like diving into right now. I suppose there's Raphael. Is he going to get killed later? Is that what's going on with him? He seems like the kind of guy who get off for money. That sounds like fun. But no, I don't know. I don't feel like there's anything else I want to kind of dive on. Are there any questions you have for me pertaining to other mysteries?
No, I think I'm well sorted in terms of answers from your Herds.
Uh-oh, that's concerning.
I will tell you that the title of the other book that our recurring character appears in is here in this novel somewhere. So
oh no,
you'll have to see how that all fits together. I'm sure there's no other poisonings anywhere. I suppose, Herds, we will have to come back to A Caribbean Mystery by Agatha Christie next week on the show. We're going to be covering chapters 10 to 17 next week. I'm especially excited because the chapter that we're wrapping up with next week, Herds, is called Mr. Raphael Takes Charge, and that can only be entertaining.
That's going to be great. I'm looking forward to Raphael being the guy who calls the shots in the murder mystery.
You're listening to Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour here on 2SER 107.3. We will be back with more of Agatha Christie next week. Stick around. We're out of here.